Hello and thanks for joining us from our studios in Israel. I'm Aaron Porras, here with ILTV's morning briefing.
IDF security forces in the West Bank have now closed off the entrances to the Palestinian town of Beit Paja following an attempted drive-by shooting attack at the nearby kibbutz Migdal Oz. Late Sunday night, just outside the kibbutz's southern entrance, a car with Palestinian plates drove up and a suspect opened fire. Thankfully, no injuries or damages were reported. But according to the military, quote, IDF troops are blocking exits from the village of Beit Paja as part of the search efforts after the terrorist. Exit permits will be granted in accordance with decisions by security forces, end quote. This is the second time recently that security forces have had to raid the village of Beit Paja. Just earlier this month, the IDF closed down an illegal weapons manufacturing shop in which they confiscated a lathe believed to have been used to create makeshift firearms. In other security-related news, Israeli defense officials are reporting Syrian pro-Assad troops moving into a new position within the demilitarized zone along the Israeli-Syrian border. The Syrian unit has set up shop in an abandoned United Nations outpost in the Golan Heights, in clear violation of the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement of 1973, the ceasefire following the Yom Kippur War. Well, although the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force is gone, even UNDOF is also now reporting ongoing development of the outpost's infrastructure. This despite UNDOF leaving Syrian outposts in 2014 after the Syrian civil war threatened their positions. IDF officials are warning that they are aware of the Syrian presence at the base, are angered at the violation of the 1973 cessation agreement, and are willing to remove the Syrians from the outpost by force if necessary. That being said, the IDF told the Khan news organization that the UN is responsible for dealing with such situations, should have prevented it to begin with, and ideally will deal with it now, before Israel intervenes militarily. We have not one but two shocking developments related to the indictment of the Prime Minister's wife, SARA NETANYAHU, alleging systematic misuse of state funds. The car, belonging to the caretaker of the Prime Minister's former residence, who successfully sued SARA NETANYAHU for abuse and has provided testimony in these new charges, has just been torched outside of his home. Police suspect a deliberate arson attack. On top of that, excerpts of a tape recording documenting alleged crimes has just been leaked to the press. The recordings were made by the Netanyahu's former advisor, Nir Chefetz, who has since turned state's witness and testified against the prime minister in at least 2 corruption investigations. The tape was apparently made back in 2010 and documents a conversation between himself and attorney Shlomit Barnea Farago, the legal advisor of the prime minister's office. The two openly discussed what seems to be an ongoing plan to deceive journalists as well as investigators in order to, quote, protect the prime minister so that he doesn't get involved in these things, end quote. Regarding SARA NETANYAHU, Chefetz says that, quote, I think she does all kinds of tricks in the hotel bills abroad to hide all kinds of expenses, end quote. He goes on to suggest that the Prime Minister's wife illicitly packs up to 4 or 5 suitcases of dirty personal laundry for trips abroad, which she brings specifically so that the foreign hotels can dry clean them. The Prime Minister's attorney then says, quote, but that's misuse of public funds, bringing laundry you're not even going to use there just so it can be cleaned, end quote. They go on to discuss allegedly illicit gifts, as well as cover stories seemingly used to evade journalists' questions. Both the Prime Minister and his wife have consistently maintained that they've done nothing wrong in any of these alleged corruption allegations, and that nothing will come from any investigation. Prime Minister Netanyahu has just introduced a new bill addressing ultra-Orthodox conscription in the IDF. Following last year's High Court ruling, the government needs to pass a new bill within the next 2 months. But the contentious issue of HAREDI enlistment in the army has proven quite difficult to negotiate. Netanyahu's proposal, which is backed by Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman's department, essentially requires annual quotas for HAREDI enlistment. If those numbers aren't met, ultra-Orthodox schools would potentially face sanctions as a consequence. Right-wing religious leaders, whose parties have a controlling part of Netanyahu's coalition, have fiercely opposed anything short of a full exemption for army service. They've already promised to vote against this bill in its current form, and possibly even drop out of the coalition altogether if a compromise isn't met. This is a similar scenario that Netanyahu faced earlier in the year. The jettison of these ultra-Orthodox parties would likely mean early elections, but speculation is high that this time around, ultra-Orthodox parties may choose to allow the first reading of the bill to pass in hopes of amending it down the road. Especially given the upcoming court-mandated deadline, there is an incentive here to find a compromise. Many believe that by passing the first reading, the Knesset can win a delay from the courts to extend that deadline, giving more room to discuss the issue. There's also a rumor that even if the enlistment bill were to become law, back-alley deals within the coalition would essentially prevent the law from actually being enforced. Critics say that this is all merely a way to cheat the court's decision and ultimately maintain the controversial status quo of full exemption for Haredim. Regardless, it remains to be seen if common ground can be found. The bill could come up for a first vote as soon as next week. It's looking like a done deal, folks. We've just learned that Eurovision 2019 will most likely end up in Tel Aviv after all. A top official at the finance ministry has just told reporters that Tel Aviv's convention center is the only venue in the country that meets all the requirements for the show. According to reports, Jerusalem isn't even in the running for hosting duties at all. This news doesn't come as a complete shock, though. Last year's Eurovision saw some 18,000 spectators come from all over the world, and the convention center in Tel Aviv is the only stadium with enough seats to accommodate such a huge crowd. The entire production itself is also a massively expensive effort, which requires round-the-clock work, rehearsals, and preparation 7 days a week, including Shabbat. Which is one big reason why production would be problematic in Jerusalem. Though Israel has held Eurovision in Jerusalem in the past, things have changed both in terms of scope and in politics. Israeli politicians were initially adamant that the show be held in Jerusalem because Israel sees the Holy City as its capital. But in light of President Trump's decision to relocate the United States Embassy to Jerusalem, fierce political opposition has reignited the debate over Jerusalem. This all came to a head earlier this month when Argentina canceled a friendly soccer match with the Israeli national team after the Knesset moved the match from Haifa to Jerusalem. Political division and alleged backdoor deals within the Israeli Culture Ministry eventually caused Argentina to cancel. The government clearly wanted to avoid a potential repeat with Eurovision 2019, though. All the more reason we can probably expect to see next year's party in Tel Aviv.
That's all for now. I'm Aaron Porras, and see you later with our main daily broadcast from Israel at 2 p.m. Eastern Time.